Hi, Dave Scotland for cgswot.com, and welcome to another tutorial. In fact, welcome to a new decade, and I hope everybody had a great New Year's celebration for 2010. And we've got some great stuff in the pipeline coming up. I'm going to be doing some webinars through Curve Studios, and we're also going to be releasing some DVDs, some workshop tutorial DVDs through Curve Studios. And I'm going to be working on some CG Swot DVDs as well, and that'll be involving a bit of compositing in After Effects, and we'll also be doing some 3D Studio Max stuff as well. So feel free to write to the blog or to correspond with the website cgswot.com and let me know any tutorials or any areas you'd like me to go into in computer graphics, and we'll try to get a tutorial up for you. I've got a couple of suggestions already that have been made by some users, and we're going to be putting together some tutorials to answer those questions. But today what we're going to have a look at is probably one of the most important things that you need to get your head around if you're going to work in computer graphics, and that is composition. And it's at the very heart of compositing, because composition is basically the laws and principles of appeal, of why an image looks good to the viewer, as opposed to why an image looks bad or fails to do the job. And these rules have actually been formulated over hundreds and hundreds of years of studying art and studying form and function in visual media. And so what we're going to do is today we're going to specifically look at one area of composition that I believe is probably the most key area of composition as it relates to compositing and 3D as well. But we'll briefly have a quick look at some of the other rules that come into composition. So here's a list, and we have quite a few rules there, but this list is in no way a definitive list. There are many more areas of composition or good composition, many more rules or principles of good composition, and hopefully I'll be doing a far more in-depth look at composition, perhaps through a DVD or a webinar, or perhaps even one of these free release tutorials. So let's have a look at this list here. Rule of thirds is the one that we're going to have a look at today in more detail, and you may have seen in the opening image I've got this grid. Oh, by the way, don't be put off by the interface for 3D for After Effects here. I've got quite a few panels sort of dragged off just to give a little bit more room and for us to be able to see a little clearer what we're going through. So that grid that you see on the image is basically rule of thirds, and we'll come back to that with a little bit more detail in a second. We've got triangles, and that's the principle of triangles and arrows in composition. We've got applied forms, and don't be confused by the word forms meaning a shape. It can also be forms formed by tonal values, shading, shadows, color, but you apply imply the form via these methods. And so each and every one of these, by the way, I could easily do an hour based on each one of them as it applies to composition. They're very in depth, and but composition and the rules of composition is not something that you're a stranger to. You as a human being have viewed life for your entire life, and many of the things that you find appealing and good or nice to look at actually adhere to these rules of composition, of good composition. So balance and contrast is the next one there, and that's fairly self-explanatory. It's bringing balance and contrast to the image, and balance through contrast. Camera tilt is another one that probably relates a little bit more to compositing and photography, using camera tilt and unique camera angles to bring good composition. The proportions of objects and proportions of elements within the scene, another area of good composition. The Fibonacci spiral, and that's something that I'm going to do an entire other tutorial based on the Fibonacci spiral. And the Fibonacci spiral is basically a mathematical principle that we associate with appealing vision. And many of the ancient buildings in history and many of the design, the key cultural design elements that you would have seen throughout your life have actually adhered to the Fibonacci spiral. And the Fibonacci spiral is a mathematical principle that is also applicable to people's faces, and if you apply the Fibonacci spiral to the world's top 5 or top 10 photographic models, you'll find that their facial features all fall into line in the Fibonacci spiral, and so I look forward to showing you a little bit more about the Fibonacci spiral in another tutorial. The Mona Lisa is another good example. Leonardo da Vinci actually painted the Mona Lisa laying all of the detail right down on top of the Fibonacci spiral. Whether he did it intentionally or not, I couldn't actually answer that question, but he is a genius. He may have actually just done it accidentally. Eye centering, another one that is very good for photographic work and also promotional stuff for a composite artist. It deals with centering the eye line down the middle of your composition, and then also balance and contrast sort of come in on that as well. Complexity versus simplicity, and that's a great one too for when you're doing abstract imagery, where you sort of offset complexity with simplicity within the scene to bring good composition. You've got motion and direction, which is a really interesting subject to have a look at in relation to especially still imagery, where you've got a still image but you have to indicate motion and direction, and if you do it correctly you can actually bring strong composition to the image as well. And so it's a fantastic subject to have a look at, motion and direction. And there are all sorts of hidden rules to motion and direction relating to where you bring a character onto a scene and when you bring an element off a scene, and they can often have they can have a bearing with good and evil. And us as human beings, we're inbuilt or inbred with these rules. And when you adhere to them, you actually get good composition. But when you break them, something just doesn't quite look right with the image. Inspiration's another element there for good composition. When you just basically play on the human emotion, you've got combination of principles, and that's an important one. And that's basically where you look through all of the good composition principles and rules, and you can use combinations, like for instance a bit of camera tilt together with a rule of thirds and together with implied forms, and you can mix them up, but only once you sort of learn why and how they're implemented. It's like anything in CG. You've got to learn how it's done and why it's done first before you can start to break those rules or push those boundaries. And having said that, I think the golden rule is that composition and good composition should always be your first port of call. You shouldn't just sit down with a pencil and a piece of paper and start drawing out a sketch. You should really think of composition. Composition is one of the first things you try to capture when you're doing a landscape painting from scratch, when you're out photographing landscapes or elements or characters. No matter what you do in a visual element, composition should always be your first port of call. So I strongly suggest that if you haven't sat down and done a little bit of composition research, that you really should, because you'll find it quite fascinating and it will definitely improve your computer graphics artwork and your digital imagery. So we'll move on now. We're going to get into the first one in our list, which is rule of thirds. And this is an example of good composition. And if we look at the image, then I mean, immediately it's sort of, it is a nice image. It has appeal. It is a nice, a good composition. But if we bring up our composition grid, our rule of thirds grid, you can sort of see why. The eye line of the insect is right on that top third, and the body of the insect is laying right down this right hand third, and sort of the center of gravity, so to speak, is right on the cross section of that third. And so that's a fantastic that is a fantastic example of rule of thirds working in a scene that really doesn't have much in it, just the one character, a bit of a blurred depth of field pushed background, and it's a very nice composition. Now, just before we move on to some of these others, I'll give you a very quick example. Now, I think this is a great example of composition. It really doesn't directly relate to rule of thirds, but I thought this was a great image. There were two contrasting images on the site that I grabbed this image from, and thank you to everyone that contributed images to this tutorial. This one here, the one you can see here, I believe is great composition. This one here is not. Can you see the difference? It's very, very subtle, and if we apply the rule of thirds, it's exactly the same. But the object, the insect, is actually looking across this tiny little space here, and then it has all of this massive space to the right hand side that's completely free and sort of dead, so to speak, dead space. And if we look at the original image again, we can see that, and I'll just hide that grid, we can see that now the insect is actually looking across this space, and he's leading this distance. The eyes are leading this distance here, and that's a very important part of good compositing as well, and I just thought it was worth mentioning. So the two images are, there's really not a lot of difference between the two images, yet there's a great deal of difference in the composition of those two images. And you'll find that this one here is, the original is much better composed, and I believe is a much nicer image. And this one, it's beautifully shot, and it does adhere to the rule of thirds, but not quite as powerful as the other image. So we'll move on. I digress. We've got this next image here, and it's a beautiful image. And if we bring up our compositional grid, you'll see there that the horizon line is lying down on this bottom third here, and we've got our key character is this standing stag here, and the horns are right up on this upper third. Its body, or pretty much its center of gravity, is laying on this horizontal, on the vertical third to the left. And what they've actually done in this image as well, which I think is worth mentioning, is they've used depth of field to bring the focus to the object, as well as using the rule of thirds. So you'll see that the depth of field is blurry, and it gets clearer as it gets to the hero of the shot here. And also the tree itself is providing some framing for the shot, and that's another area of good composition, is to frame the shot. And I believe I've got another image coming up that I can show you that a little bit better. But yeah, even the branch that comes across here is actually falling on that line, and helping to frame this character over on the right hand side, and it drops off into depth of field into the background as well. And there's also some nice balance of contrast, where we have light areas over here contrasted by the character, and we've also got this tree element here which is quite dark, and it's contrasting in tonal value with the background, and it's also contrasting with the foreground as well. And so that's quite a nice image, and there are some of the reasons why compositionally it is a nice image. So we've got our next image here, and this is quite nice. This looks something that has been heavily treated in post-production. It's quite a simple scene, and it is appealing to look at, and so let's have a look at why, at some of the reasons why this is actually appealing to look at. First, if we have a look at our grid, we've got the hot spot in the sky falls right on the cross section of these 2/3, and that really emphasizes it. Like if I hide that again, you can really see that it sort of draws the eye to that point, and then it brings you down into the image. And that's one of the major functions of composition, is to lead you around the image, lead you to certain points that the artist wants you to look at in a sequence. I want you to look here, and then I want you to look there, and in this instance the artist wants you to look up to the sky first and then fall down onto the image. The tonal values help that, as of course, as well. And then you've got the horizon line, which nicely sort of sits around that bottom third area, and you've even got these two islands that are sort of separated with the thirds as well, and so this is actually quite a nice image. You've got your foreground building here is actually falling on that horizontal, the vertical right third, so it's actually quite a nice image. A very simple image, but good composition can turn a simple image into a lasting image. So we've got this next one here, very simple, something that you could have taken out on your holidays, but this is a good example of framing, in that the important feature of the picture is the Dad and Dave in the boat here having a fish, and you can see that the photographer has actually, or the post-production artist has used depth of field to push the focal point up to that point, and then beyond it starts to fall into blur again. So the focal point is through the middle of the image here, or where our intrepid duo are. But also this foreground information here points, almost literally points to the boat. You've got this little bit of foreground shoreline is pointing at the main characters, and that leads your eye to the specific focal point that the artist wants you to have a look at. And this bush on the right hand side helps frame the image. The image is wider and larger. You could easily have cropped the image down in here, but compositionally it may not have looked as powerful as framing using natural elements within the scene. And that's a very key compositional choice. If we bring up our grid, you know, we've got our horizon line. Although it's not a horizon, our horizon is somewhat down lower here, but it's a hill, and it's sort of a fake horizon due to its elevation, and so it comes through the top third there. We've got our boat with our characters here are sitting on the bottom third, and the vertical left-hand third is falling right down through our characters, and that of course is great composition. Quite deliberately, I think the foreground that is jutting out here is actually not set right on that bottom third, but actually a little lower than it, which can bring more emphasis to this focal point here. And so compositionally, this is a great image. You know, the tonal values and colours and things like that, it needs a bit of work, but I believe compositionally this is a fantastic image. So we'll look at the next one. This one looks like it's been heavily processed, but it does adhere to some great compositional principles. And if we bring up our grid, straight away we can see our horizon line is nice and in the close proximity of that bottom third there. The trees sort of lop off at the top on the top third there, which sort of implies a depth that comes through the top third. We've got our little township over here to the right that sort of falls right on that cross section there. And we've also got a powerful bank or curve that leads us to that township. So the first thing we see in this image is the color, of course, and the tonal values, where we're dark out here on the left hand side, and over to the right it's lighter. So what will happen is we'll look at this image as a whole, and the tonal value in this instance, because it is so tonally out of the norm, we'll sort of concentrate on that up front, and it'll push us to the lighter value. So we will get pushed in. Quite often in compositing we'll use a vignette where we darken the edges around the image, and that serves exactly the same purpose, which is to push the viewer into the image, into the center or the focal point of the image. And so that's what's happening here, where we've got this dark segment. It's pushing us into the image over on the right hand side here. The township and the trees here are the focal point. And then the second thing is the shape here, where we see this bend in the bank is pushing us up. It's curving up towards exactly what we should be looking at over here. And then we've got our rule of thirds, which is subliminally lining us up with exactly what we should be looking at, which is this area over here. Tantastic composition in that piece. Our next image here, this was a digital map painting challenge that was held by CG Tantra, and this was the winning entry, and compositionally you can see why it was the winning entry. I mean, it was it's got fantastic compositional qualities. We can bring up our grid, and straight away we can see our main element, which is our rickety old house here. And even the light that can be seen up in the top here falls on that right hand vertical third. It's almost like you can almost, after looking at the image with the grid, you could take the grid away and almost still see the image, because the grid goes right through the roof line where it meets the wall. The bottom of the building actually sits right on that grid line as well. The front corner, the closest corner to the viewing position in this image, sits right on the vertical right third, and so that really is the focal point of the image. And he or she has really used the grid, the rule of thirds grid, to sort of work out the composition for this piece. But there's some other elements in it that are pushing your eye around the piece. First of all, you've got motion here, and as soon as you see the bird, you've got a sense of motion, that it's flying. It's about to land, but it's coming in from the left of camera, and sort of almost flying over the shoulder of the photographer in this piece, or the artist, and landing on the stump. So it's moving towards the building. It's another form of bringing your eyes to the focal point. And then you've got this ridge line that flows down here, beautifully pointing using the triangle method, because it's offset. The ridge line is offset by the shoreline, and it forms a perfect triangle pointing exactly to where you're supposed to be looking, which is the old building here. It's a fantastic piece of composition, and thoroughly, I believe, deserve it. Even the tonal values, the darker areas at the top here, pushing you down into the image. You've got darker areas in the foreground on the left-hand left-hand side down here, pushing you up into the image. Fantastic example of good composition. And next image here. This is a photographic image. Quite a simple image, but it's very appealing. Quite a beautiful image. A lot of texture in this image. It's another good rule of composition, is texture. Texture on surfaces, texture being picked up, or contrast and light and shade being picked up by the texture within the image. And if we bring up our composition grid, you'll see that the horizon line does in fact go right through that third, the bottom third there. Perfectly goes through, even despite the fact that there is a slope. The horizon line holds up because it goes through that third, and without placing the horizon line on that bottom third, you may actually get the sense as a viewer that the image is tilted, that the camera is slightly tilted, especially given that the trees themselves are very gnarly and bent and not straight up and down. But because it sits on that bottom third, our mind makes that decision for us, and we see a couple of straight up and down sort of angles, and we say, yep, that's the horizon line through there, and we make that decision. Good composition will actually help the viewer understand depth and understand where they are in the world while they're looking at this picture. And that's good composition, and it's used through. Another good example of that is, I'll just switch our grid off. We have distance fog happening in the background, and then as we come more closer to the foreground here, the fog's not quite as definitive, but you will see that as we go back into the image we get the distance fog, and not a lot of distance has happened before that fog actually gets quite thick. And that way we can start to make decisions on the climate and what sort of climate is this picture taken in. You know, it seems misty and foggy, and it's of course supported by the plant life and the moss and the vines and whatnot growing on the branches. So if we switch our grid back on, we've got our main tree over here. It's off the line, but I believe the artist probably doesn't want you to concentrate right on this tree. I think the artist wants you to concentrate on this tiny little square down through here, and then how everything sort of branches out from it. If you look at all of the angles, everything sort of comes from this small section in here. Cinematography wise, this is a fantastic piece. It reminds me some of the shots from Lord of the Rings. You could easily have a character sort of moving through the mist in the background here, and I would guarantee that you as the viewer would find that character in this image, just given the compositional rules that have been adhered to here. We've got the right hand vertical third has these two trees that are contrasting in shape. One is leaning to the right, one is leaning to the left, and they meet on that line. Compositionally, these things are there. I mean, often the artist doesn't even see them through the lens, but it's in their mind, and when they're moving that camera around and about to lock it off as a shot, before they snap that button, they've made a lot of these decisions based on good compositional principles that they've come across either as a viewer in life or through their study or profession. And in this instance, you know, some of these things could have been a complete accident, but the result is a good, appealing piece, good composition. Okay, so the last image that we're going to have a look at is a fairly simple cityscape. Very appealing image. It's nicely done. If we bring up our grid, we can see that there's some rules that have been adhered to here. First, the horizon line does sit nicely on that bottom third, although you will see that it is slightly above the actual horizon line, but I think that's compensated by the fact that the viewing position of the photographer is a little bit elevated, and so you can actually get the same effect by just rising it slightly in the composition. We've got our right hand vertical third. It sort of splits these two buildings, and I think it does it quite nicely. You've got this tall building in the center. Rather than stick that right in the center of the image or have it right on the third, by splitting these two larger buildings with that vertical third, it brings these extra buildings on the right hand side here into the image a little bit more, which I think is a good choice. We've also got, I believe the focal point is really this main part of the city here, and we're sort of brought to that by a slope in the buildings on the left hand side here, just sloping down and drawing a sort of a curved line, bringing us down to here. Now, a fortunate occurrence here for the photographer is we've got all of these harsh vertical and horizontal lines that are man-made structures here, but the clouds in the sky are actually quite bulbous and curved, both in their shape and in their composition. So the contrast of both of those sort of shapes are actually adding to the composition. Plus the shapes in the sky, the actual sky hole here through the clouds in the right hand side is offset and balanced by the sky hole over here. And the clouds actually push back into the image. And we've got some great example here of framing of the image with these foreground tree elements on the right hand and bottom of the shot here. And that could have been emphasized a little bit more by some depth of field, but that's got a lot to do with the camera lens that's used at the time and the settings used on the camera. So certainly something as a composite artist, if you were to bring these elements in post to sort of frame up the shot, then you could probably push a little bit of blur onto those elements to really emphasize the direction that you want the viewer to take. But some great elements there for framing. The clouds also assist with the framing. This tall building on the left hand side actually assists with the framing as well. And so we have some very nice compositional decisions that have gone into this image to make it quite appealing, even though it is quite a simple image. So there's some images that we've had a look at. I decided not to show you images of bad composition, but basically I did show you that one example, and although it is still a fairly nice composition, it does actually sort of break one of the important rules of composition, and that was the one with the insect that we had a look at. So I decided to just go with some good composition and show you some of the compositional decisions or choices that went into those images, whether by specific design or whether by accident. Those compositional elements were evident in those images, and I think therefore made those images quite nice to look at and appealing, and the design of those shots were actually quite nice. So the rule of thirds: basically the total image area is divided vertically and horizontally into 3 equal sections. So I'm just going to stop the tutorial here, and when we come back I'm just going to give you a brief 10-minute run through of how to create a compositional grid in After Effects that you can use above your camera in a top layer, so that as you're starting to lay things out, whether it be text or shapes or colors or textures, you can bear in mind that rule of thirds as you put your composition together, as you put your compositing project together. So we'll leave it there, and we'll come back into a fresh After Effects project.